All right, welcome to the IECC DGC code hearing, committee hearing number 8. Hopefully you see the agenda on the screen there. For those of you that are part of the panelists and the committee, we ask that you please turn your camera on throughout the hearing so that we simulate as being in a room as possible. But please mute yourself unless you are speaking. If you need to attend to a text message, phone call, or email, feel free to go ahead and turn your camera off for the few minutes you need to do that and then come back on screen. Right now, we are scheduled to end at 5 o'clock. We will have a break about halfway through. And then along those lines with a timer or timing, we have a timer that anybody that needs to speak will have a timer on the screen with a countdown on that. Today, our note taker is Charlie. We have a few other guests for subject matter experts. If you haven't seen some of those names before, those will be NBI, Sean, and Taylor from Group 14. And there might be a few more here that join a little bit later, but that's all I know for now at the moment that are on the screen. So we are going to be following Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rule of Order, if you aren't familiar with that, I'll go through that quickly, and then we'll do a quick roll call. So the proposal will be introduced by the moderator, myself. Then we'll ask the proponent to speak to tell us a little summary of the proposal. We will then go to the general public to see if anybody wants to speak in support of the proposal. They will have 2 minutes to do so. Once everybody has spoken support, then we'll go to the general public to ask anybody to speak in opposition. They will also have 2 minutes to do so. From there, we go to the committee. The committee at that time will have opportunity to ask questions of the proponent of the proposal to the proponent. After those questions are done, we will go back to the general public. For anybody that has a rebuttal and support, they will have 1 minute to speak their mind. And after all those are done, we'll have any rebuttals in opposition, and they will have 1 minute to speak their mind. From there, we go back to the committee for any motions. So any discussion, any modifications, a call to vote, any of that above. So those are Robert's Rules of Order. I want to make sure that everybody knows how to use the raise your hand function. That's how we communicate with each other. So everybody on the panelists and from the general public, please raise your hand virtually. This is how we're going to know if you want to speak. So general public and panelists, make sure you can raise your hand via the Zoom platform before we get started. I don't see anybody from the general public raising their hands. That could be troublesome. Okay, there we go. We got at least one person there, 2 people. Great. Looks like everybody else has raised their hand. Go ahead and lower your hands. I want to make sure that you all, someone just give me a head nod that you can see my screen and it's the agenda. It's the correct screen. Good, thank you. And then Charlie, we got some people coming in, but what we'll do is we'll hold off. We'll give you a few minutes to catch up on names and attendance. We'll introduce the first proposal, and before we vote, we'll go back to you to make sure that anybody that's come in that might be substituting for somebody gets acknowledged and what have you. So item number 6, the first thing on the agenda, just to remind you that this was introduced to the committee back in February. So this is not the first time that you all have seen this, but this is now the time that we are going to pull a vote on it.
Kevin,
so
how
with
are we
that being
looking
said,
for quorum for voting?
Let's see if Charlie, well, I'll give Charlie a minute there, but just to answer your question, first off, is that what we've done in the past is if we don't have quorum, we'll make a note of that and continue to move forward since we only have a few meetings left, but we are going to try to still hit quorum, if you will. So it won't delay the hearing. Good question. Any other questions before we get started? I don't see any. So I'll pull up the item number 6 to the screen. And NBI, Sean, do you want to give us a brief summary of this proposal.
So I believe Katrina has a couple of words first, and then we'll go into the rest of the introduction.
Thanks, Sean. That's right. Hi, everyone. I was wondering actually if I could share my screen for just a moment. Is that possible, Kevin? And thank you so much.
Sure.
So we'll start today the discussion of the high impact proposals that were developed by working groups with the discussion of the C406 commercial prescriptive path. I perhaps should have started by even introducing myself. I'm Katrina Manigan, Director of Buildings and Homes for Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resiliency. And I played the role of facilitator for the working groups. And so I thought I would just start by giving you a little bit of context on who was part of the working group developing the proposal that you're about to hear. So the participants, as you can see, included a number of city staff that met over the course of the 4 meetings, as well as participants from Energetics, RMH Group, 4240 Architecture. The working group combined 2 proposals that you had seen before, the minimum renewables proposal with the C406 proposal. They also combined this with a number of related C406 proposals that add additional flexible ways to earn credits. So now you have 1 proposal for the prescriptive path for commercial buildings before you today. There is still a path for all gas buildings within this proposal to achieve the requirements, but the proposal incentivizes all electric or partially electric buildings. So with that, I'll pass it to Sean to walk you through the proposal itself.
All right. So I can go ahead and share it so that everyone can see it. Oh, never mind. It is up already. All right. Thank you. So I want to start with just a brief overview of some of the things that this does do and what it doesn't do. So as Katrina said, we have 2 main things that are happening here, and I think it's worth thinking about it in those terms. We have, it's calibrating C406 to Denver's goals, and it is also adding flexibility to help support Denver's goals. So this is the addition of additional efficiency options and that allow projects to get those additional points. This does include the addition of both demand responsive thermostats and renewable energy to this to add, since the working group felt that these weren't quite ready for mandatory, so we brought them into C406, both to encourage their use and to provide that additional flexibility. I want to start with some of the changes that we have seen since the last time you saw this project through the working group process. So the first is that the definition of all electric property has been modified to explicitly allow combustion for emergency power systems and standby power systems. This was felt to be the clearest way to ensure that all electric buildings didn't inadvertently or give the impression that these sorts of systems were not allowed in all electric buildings. So it doesn't distinguish between whether they are required by a code requirement or have been elected by the building owner. They are just allowed as systems because they serve this very specific project. And that's why the definitions we see added for emergency power system and standby power system, just for clarity. As I mentioned, if we can go down to the table. Well, actually, I'm sorry, just stay with the definitions. So we also added the definitions for demand responsive controls, demand response signal from that demand response proposal that you've seen before, and also a definition for demand response program that gets leveraged below in the demand response option. And we'll talk about that when we get down there. The next thing is, if we go down to the table. So for all electric projects, they do still need to have a modest amount of efficiency from their all electric systems. And so you can see all of these additional options that we have. We've removed the COP requirement for all electric properties to really encourage this first step to electrification. And then that simplifies all electric projects going through, and it also simplifies the options that we see down here, the C406.12 and 0.13 for all electric space heating and all electric water heating, easing the point of entry into getting those points as well. And if you can scroll down to the other table, you'll see that the building types have been simplified. This came in an interaction between multiple working groups because the building types are also used in the modeling proposals. And there was the strong feeling in the modeling proposals working groups that having the building types split either by size or by number of stories added a certain amount of confusion, and that the distinction in the goals maybe didn't really align with what particularly what modelers were seeing in practice. And so in the modeling working group, there was the desire to simplify this back to the building types that are utilized in ASHRAE Appendix G. So in order to keep that correlation between C406 and the modeling, we also brought the building types to be the same ones, just for clarity and ease of use. And you'll notice that the credit requirements are very similar to last time, but there was a little bit of modification to the credit requirements for some of the building types to ensure that there really was a workable path through those credit options for all of the types. So the credit requirement for retail was lowered a little bit just to make sure that there was that path through, that it was achievable for a mixed fuel building going by, because keep in mind, all electric properties do just have to achieve the 10. And now if we can go back up to the other table, we did include some additional modifications that don't change the actual requirements, but are intended to make this table more usable. Many of the credit options actually have opportunities to get higher credits than what is listed in the table, but you have to go down to the sections before you see that. So particularly for additional heating and cooling efficiency, additional LPD efficiency, and additional on-site renewable energy. And so what we've tried to do is indicate that here in the table. Since we're asking for more credits, we want to really provide clear communication to project groups. So you can see that we've called out that you can see the section for additional efficiency in cooling and heating efficiency. You'll see that there's a C section by the reduced lighting power by 15%, because that is a calculation that is in the lighting power section. And there's also that little C that indicates the note below that, and that indicates that if you go beyond 15%, that there are additional credits available. So we included a complete line for this 15%, which wasn't there before, just for that additional clarity. And then on renewable energy, you'll see that we included an on-site renewable energy credit range. So to really make it clear that there is a range of credits, it's not just that static lower end that you can go higher. However, across the multiple working groups, there was the feeling that there did need to be a reasonable cap on the amount of renewable energy that could be used for compliance, that we wanted the flexibility of renewable energy and compliance, but didn't want to allow too much trade-off of fundamental efficiency for renewable energy. So 10% was included as the cap pretty much across the board in most of the compliance paths. And if we can go down to the language for the C406.12, we're going to dig in just a little bit to modifications made to the electrification section, the partial electrification options. So these were simplified and dialed back, as I mentioned earlier, to allow for a lower point of entry. They do allow, so in this case with space heating, they do allow for electric resistance heat, just a certain amount, just as we saw before. But the heat pumps, they do need to either be cold climate heat pumps in order to keep operating expenses in line, or they need to, the space also needs to be served by energy recovery ventilation, which is now a requirement for multifamily dwelling units under the 2021 code. So this does mean that for buildings that are pursuing the space heating option, they don't have to be super efficient electric heating, but we did want to provide a minimum amount of efficiency to protect the users from any utility bill impacts. So that's what the ERV does for code compliant heat pumps. And then if we go down to water heating, this was simplified substantially. And you'll see it really is that it's just electric water heating. There are additional credits available for going to higher performance water heating, but really wanted to just create that, that entry point so that we are seeing the electrification of water heating. In commercial, that is a much more straightforward proposition than it is in the residential section. And then you'll also see some of the additional credit options here that have been added since the last time. So demand responsive controls, you'll see before it was a functionality requirement when it was a mandatory requirement that the controls had to be capable of doing a certain thing. But the working group discussed the desire to ensure that demand responsive controls were really well aligned with available demand responsive programs so that occupants could first day use their demand responsive controls rather than waiting for Excel to catch up with national standards. So it specifies that the controls have to be listed for participation in a demand response program. And that's where that definition above comes in that serves the building site. This ensures that demand responsive controls will be functional from day one. And then we see these additional options for system fan power reductions that this is an opportunity for credit options from reducing HVAC fan power, which can be a really powerful option in a lot of systems, but one of the other groups felt like it wasn't quite ready for a mandatory requirement. And that covers the main differences. We can get into questions, but I think Courtney has one last thing to introduce you to before we move on.
Thank you, Sean. Kevin, if you don't mind scrolling down to the Denver Green Code portion, I just want to be efficient with our time here. So just a note about the Denver Green Code portion of this proposal, it layers onto the base code, requiring projects to achieve 10% better than the base code. So it keeps the same credits and flexibility as the base code while increasing the stringency for projects that choose to pursue the Denver Green Code. So the only difference really is between the base code that you just heard Sean describe and this proposal, this chart you see here, is that the credit requirements are 10% higher. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Katrina, Sean, and Courtney for the introduction of this proposal. That will bring us to the next section where we go to the general public. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. I see one, and that's Mark. Mark, please introduce yourself. You should be allowed to talk now, and you'll have 2 minutes to speak.
Hello, Mark Jelinski, RMH Group, mechanical engineer. First of all, I am in favor of this. I'm certainly in favor of the overall concept of allowing for designers to come up with ways to meet these requirements. The committee could get into some of the details of this. I would suggest that the working group has worked a lot of this out. There are definitely some issues that we will find when we go to apply this. One example is that heat pump equipment requirement that is pretty specific to small air source heat pumps. There really isn't a heating season performance factor for larger or air to water or water to water type heat pumps. So it's not perfect, I guess, is the reason I'm saying that, and we need to acknowledge that. But otherwise, overall, I'm well in favor of this. As a designer, it gives us that ability to look at all these options and come up with something. I did the math on this, and you may want to highlight this a little bit more too, is what's the sum of all the points. It looks like it's a significant amount of points. Over 100 points are available for each type of building that you've got here, and you only need up to like 48. So I think that's okay. The other detail here is that breakout in building types, group B. You say office group B. Well, there's more than offices to group B. What about higher education? I hesitate to make you spend an hour and a half on this again, but I'm overall in favor of it. How about that?
Thank you, Mark. Anybody else that wants to speak in support from the general public? Johnny, I see your hands up. Please introduce yourself and you will have 2 minutes to speak.
Thank you so much. Johnny Kocher here with Rocky Mountain Institute. We'd like to speak in favor of this proposal. We are encouraged to see Denver moving towards having more ambitious proposals that will incentivize building electrification. Our stated goal within the carbon-free buildings group is to basically ask municipalities and states to move towards all electric buildings as soon as possible. And we believe that this is a good step forward. We hope that the IECC doesn't reduce any point thresholds for this proposal, and would like to encourage the group to pass it forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. Third and final call. Anybody else from the general public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. Seeing none, I'll go to opposition. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this proposal, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Third and final call. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we will go back to the committee. Committee, hold tight. We will ask some questions. This will be your time to ask questions, but before we do that, I do see some new faces on the screen, so we'll go to our note taker to see if anybody's filling in for anybody and what are how many voting members we have.
Yes, thanks, Kevin. So I think the simplest way for me to handle this is just to call out the people that I do have recorded as being in attendance. So as of right now, I have 17 voting members present, with only 16 votes being cast in because I have Laura London and Colin Anderson both accounting for 1 vote. So I'm sure you guys will settle amongst yourself who's going to cast in the vote. But other than Laura and Colin, the other voting members I have recorded are Aaron Esseling, Alan Yoneng, Ashley Wheeler, Chrissy Collins, Chuck Bartel, Courtney Anderson, Elizabeth Gilmore, Eric Browning, Jamie, I'm sorry if I butchered your last name, it's Bachut, Ken Urbanek, Lauren Collin, Linda Morrison, Mike Walton, Nate Hoyler, Robert Pruitt, and Alex Martin. So if I missed anybody's name or if anybody's substituting in for someone else, if you could let me know.
Yeah, I'm Caitlin Anderson, substituting for Jamie Bacchus.
Okay, perfect.
Cool. Thanks, Charlie. So that will bring us to that. Let's go to the next category here now. We'll open up to the committee for anybody that has questions about this proposal. Questions only. Anybody from the committee have questions, please raise your hand. Second call for questions. Oh, maybe the subcommittee did really well. You don't have any questions, that's great. And third and final call for questions on this one. I have one hand. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were still talking to the general public. I have a question. You know, we've talked about calibration multiple times as far as calibrating the points to both C407 as well as Denver's goals. Could you describe what that process is and if there's committee involvement in that?
Sure. So if you look at the proposal as it is now, there is a section that talks about how the performance targets basically were calibrated both to Denver's goals and to each other. And the two ways to, I think the high level way to look at it is that, you know, Denver has goals for % improvement in each code cycle. And if we take those and we relate where the 2019 Denver Energy Code was to where these national model codes are, which we have, and right now it's based on the estimates of the performance of the Denver Energy Code and the IECC 2021. We actually do have a determination study for 90.1 2019. And so once we can see what the relationship between those are, then we can relate the actual base codes that we're working with to the Denver Energy Code in 2019. Part of the goals for improvements for the Energy Code is the result of the fact that the Energy Code doesn't deliver the same results in all building types. But Denver's goal is the same for all building types, not in terms of the same EUI, but the same level of performance. So that implementation, so the Denver's plan shows this stepping percentage improvement per code cycle based on different building types. And so with those two factors together, we're able to see what the % improvement needs to be over Denver Energy Code, and then therefore over either the IECC 2021 or ASHRAE 2019 for each building type. And it was, so that's the basic process of doing it. The process of determining those % improvements for each code cycle is described more fully in Denver's net zero energy implementation plan. So even though we're not really, that's kind of the starting point for our discussion, but in terms of how those goals were set, that is described more fully in that plan.
So I didn't totally follow, like, are the points that we're seeing here, are these the actual points, or are these still subject to further changes?
So these are the points that represent meeting Denver's goals for this code cycle for the most part. I did mention that a couple of the building types had already been calibrated to ensure that those credit targets were reasonable based on the credits that were available. But these do represent what the code will need to do to meet Denver, to keep Denver going on its trajectory, to meet its ultimate goals by kind of making consistent stringency improvements in each code cycle.
I might chime in to try to answer a bit more directly, Elizabeth. I don't think we intend to do any further calibration, but would defer to Eric if he would want to say otherwise. But we intend to defer to what the working groups have done to calibrate these to really kind of strike that balance that the working groups were seeking to be both bold and ambitious and practical and implementable, and that we have worked with the working groups to align, as Sean said, each proposal with Denver's goals. So we don't intend to change this or calibrate any of these again.
Yeah, without further specific recommendation, there's not an intent to revise these further at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, seeing no more hands up for the question period, we'll go back to the general public. Anybody from the general public that wants to have a rebuttal and support, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to have a rebuttal and support, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to have a rebuttal and support. Seeing none, and seeing that we had nobody from the general public speak in opposition, there's no opportunity for them to have a rebuttal. So we go back to the committee. Committee, This opportunity is now open for further discussion or to make a motion. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, can we look at the all electric space heating section? I have some questions here about what we consider to be then all electric space heating. Mark kind of alluded to this a little bit, but the data here for getting the COPs and the HSPFs, this is going to be hard, if not impossible to get even for all electric buildings. I think I've said this, I feel like I've said this a dozen times, but we will not get P-tax or V-tax with COPs less than 1.5 when operating at 5 degrees. They don't exist. I would like to see that just disappear. And part of why that is your exception here where the building's served by an energy recovery system with a sensible recovery efficiency of not less than 75%. That also does not align with what's code required for where we're typically going to see P-tax and V-tax. The 2021 IECC requirement for energy recovery for dwelling units, like this, which is where we're going to mostly see P-tax and V-tax, is only a 50% effectiveness in cooling and 60% effectiveness in heating. So if you want to try to allow P-tax and V-tax, if you're going to keep the requirement number 1, you need to make the exception align with where P-tax and V-tax are going to be used, or just get rid of number 1 if you want to keep the energy recovery section as is.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth.
Can I keep going? I have some more.
Oh, yeah, sure. Go right ahead. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, could we also, so that's one, just, I'll throw that out there. Can we also scroll up just back to the points table? And this is more of just a kind of a clarification thing, or, kind of making things be a little bit more matchy-matchy. Where the way that we're showing the on-site renewable energy, where we have a range of points there for the variety of renewables that we're going to get. I'm curious why you didn't do the same thing for reduced lighting power, where we've got a footnote that says additional credits are available, but is there a reason you wouldn't make those styles match each other?
The main reason being that lighting technology continues to advance. So if we put an upper limit on it, then we would actually be thwarting technological advancement, because as more efficient fixtures, more efficient lamps and more efficient luminaires in their delivery of light come out, they will be able to continue to scale up the number of credits that they can get. So any kind of cap that we put on would end up it would really be capping what the technology can deliver in buildings. We could set it for what the technology can do right now, but lighting is probably the building technology that is seeing the most rapid advancement, even still.
So there is no intent to actually cap lighting like the way C406 is now, kind of leaving that somewhat limitless?
Yeah, the intent is for it not to be capped because it's efficiency, as opposed to renewable energy, which is not efficiency, it's energy production.
Yeah, I get that. It just doesn't really align with anything else. I mean, to that end, why wouldn't you reduce, air infiltration, or not put a limit to that, or not put a limit to heating or cooling efficiency?
So there's not a limit to heating or cooling efficiency. That can scale up with technological advancements as well. For air infiltration reductions, I suppose there is a practical limit, but part of it is that the code, these are all credit options where the code includes a equation for calculating additional credits. And so we are just pointing to where the code has created this opportunity for additional credits to be calculated through an equation. we don't have something like that for air infiltration, so we don't have an equation to leverage to show it as a range.
I think I'm not disparaging that at all. I'm just trying to get the language to be a little more obvious. So, like for, like heating and cooling, it just says C section, where, for lighting, we have a footnote instead of C section. And there may be reasoning for that, but like I look at this and it's just kind of confusing. And then renewable energy shows a range instead of saying C section. So is there a way that we can make those just be more consistent in how we're describing them while still meeting that intent? It's just a little messy. Like presumably for on-site renewable energy, for me to figure out how to calculate whether I'm getting 9 to 18 points, I still have to see a section, right? So we just seem to have some inconsistencies in how we're describing the points. So, whether if there is no cap, should we indicate that here? If there's a range of points, what is the starting point? It's just that there's inconsistency in how we're describing the point potential between those various items, and it would be nice to get those two align a bit better. Not sure.
Sure. So we can note that, and there might, I don't know, there might be a possibility where we just clean that table up to be more consistent throughout without changing those values. So we'll see if the committee or the subject matter experts can think on that while we continue forward.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm going for. Like, if I look at this, I'd like to be able to see, what is my point potential for 10% cooling efficiency. Well, I have to go look at a section, but I don't have to look at that section for lighting. I could see, oh, well, if I'm group R, it's 3+ points, or is it just 3 points? It would be nice to be able to have this table clear enough so that people can see where the potential is immediately.
Understood. Do you have anything else, Elizabeth?
Not at the moment, thank you.
Okay. All right, we'll go to the next person, which is Caitlin filling in for Jamie.
So just to, kind of what Elizabeth was just saying about the table, I do agree, because there's also, for example, for heating and cooling improvement efficiency, you have a bunch of different rows. And so for lighting, but then, like you said, on-site renewable is just a range. So there's just kind of that type of thing too. I think this might also be tied to what you were saying earlier. So these, from what I was understanding that you were saying, these point values in the table are based on Denver's goals and the reduction that we need for this code cycle. But have there been any studies related to like what the goals that are being set for C407 are? So like how complying with C406 relates to complying with C407? And sorry, this has been discussed already. I'm just joining in late.
So the same process was used for each one. So we were using that process of the % improvement that would be needed for each building type. That was the beginning of the process. Then that % improvement was translated into credits for the prescriptive path, and then % improvement for the modeling path. So both of them were drawn from the same fundamental calibration exercise. So unlike it wasn't a matter of it was developed for one and then the other was calibrated to, so we didn't develop the targets for one path and then calibrate the other path to it. We developed the performance improvement and then calibrated all of the compliance paths to that performance improvement.
All right, it looks like Caitlin's okay with that answer for now, or at least she put her hand down. Cool, so we'll move on to Ken.
Well, thank you. I guess this kind of goes back to something that Mark and the public brought up and Elizabeth touched on, and that is we do need to find a way to I'm not sure what the language is yet to allow for heat pumps that don't have HSPF ratings utilized. Almost all of the commercial grade heat pumps don't have that. So I'm curious how we can maybe rephrase that heat pump equipment, because I do think there's a lot of great products out there. I just think I don't know what the exact limits are in sizing for HSPF. It's just not super common. It's primarily small commercial equipment or residential equipment. I'll keep thinking about the language and see if I can come up with something here shortly, but I don't have anything yet. I want to see if somebody else had an idea of maybe how we could rewrite that.
Sure. Thanks, Ken. Any other discussion? The committee, Elizabeth, go ahead.
I'll only just chime in there again to expand on that. It's hard to find, even when we do have, heat pumps with rated COPs, to actually get data about where they are operating at 5 degrees. So, it might be a super great heat pump that does meet this requirement, and I won't be able to pull that data off of a manufacturer's website or a cut sheet, or make the mechanical engineer find it for us.
All right,
So
Ken, you're up
that is
next.
going to be a struggle for the community to try to meet that. And we'll, I would say, in our goals of electrification, are going to make electrification harder, just so everyone knows.
Yeah, I'm really just going to second what Elizabeth is saying there. Most of the time, the cut sheet's listed at AHRI conditions, which, I want to say are 47 degrees outside, not 5. And that's kind of where the HSPF comes into play. Advanced manufacturers, we can get that information, but yeah, it is pulling teeth, and usually we can only get it from the really advanced manufacturers, and advanced equals $signs. And there's jobs that need that and jobs that don't need that. So it's challenging, and I know this, of course, is added option here, but.
When the working group was discussing this one, there was this simultaneous desire to make sure that the option was as broad as possible and worked in as many situations as possible, but then also provided at least a certain amount of efficiency to protect the occupants about the utility bill impact of electrification in this case. So that's why it was kind of formulated in these 3 big ideas. One was allowing electric resistance heat, but only allowing so much, so that it could be used for spot and boost heating, but it could also be used for a super insulated building to just be their heating system. Then a heat pump that is a cold climate heat pump, but recognizing that right now the industry is not providing, we don't have cold climate heat pump options across the board. And the size limitation that you bring up is one of the big ones, that we just don't have larger cold climate heat pump equipment yet. And so that's why this last one comes in, that a code compliant heat pump that has energy recovery ventilation. So you can always use a code compliant heat pump, but it would need to have energy recovery ventilation. I think it's a simple modification to fully align the energy recovery ventilation with the requirements for multifamily. Right now, they're aligned with other energy recovery ventilation requirements in the code. But Elizabeth brings up a good point. There are specific energy recovery ventilation requirements for multifamily units. So we could align this exception fully with that fairly easily. In fact, while people were talking, I worked up the language. I can drop it in chat if you would like to see it. But that being then the options, that you can always use a code compliant heat pump. It's just you would also need to have the energy recovery ventilation to go with it.
The one thing I might add there, oh, go ahead. I think Courtney, sorry. I was gonna just clarify one thing.
Sure. Sean, I have a quick question about the path for P-tax. I think on the all electric path that we have, so if you're an all electric building, didn't we take out the COP requirements and those requirements that would prohibit P-tax and V-tax if you're following the all electric path?
So that was where we put in this allowance. It went through several permutations. One was, originally there was just kind of an average COP requirement for the electric equipment, and that was removed in favor of these requirements for both all electric buildings and then any buildings that want the partial electrification credit. So getting around it really does come to that, the energy recovery ventilation.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. And yeah, I don't know if you, oh, you did drop the language in. I think we should all take a minute to look at that. Thank you.
Ken, I see your hands up. Do you still have a question or comment?
Yeah, Sean, I see that you dropped that information in there. Was that what you were talking about as far as modifying?
Yeah, the exception could be easily modified to fully align it with multifamily ERV requirements as opposed to the other commercial ERV requirements that are in place in the code.
Okay. I like that language. I guess to address the HSPF language, I was thinking what might be a good way to rephrase this would be, and this again is on screen there, so this would be 2 and then 2.1. And I'm curious to see what the group thinks about this, is to say, you know, where an HSPF is not available, comma, heat pumps shall have a rated COP of not less than 1.75. We can always get COPs. It can be a challenge to get them at 5 degrees, but I think that would kind of clarify that we would be allowed to use a heat pump that doesn't explicitly have an HSPF rating. So I guess I'm proposing a modification there, Kevin. Do you want me to repeat that so you can get it in there?
Yes, that'd be great.
Yeah. I would say where an HSPF rating is not available, and then just comma, heat pump shall have a rated COP. Now, what this may do though is inadvertently, it would remove the requirement for the COP for any of those that do have an HSPF. But I think that would be acceptable given that the HSPF is specifically trying to address this particular issue.
So if,
Okay, thanks,
if the
Ken.
change is made, one of the things that a cold climate heat pump does is it sacrifices total efficiency for low temperature efficiency. And so if you sacrifice the COP at 5 degrees, then that means that that low temperature efficiency, which is kind of the most critical efficiency in Denver's climate, also gets sacrificed. I think if you wanted to make a change like that, it might be, you would say, you would put that on 2.2 and or 2.3, or maybe create a 2.4 so that you maintain the low temperature COP, because that's what makes a cold climate heat pump a cold climate heat pump. An HSPF of 10 and 9 is actually lower than a high performance heat pump.
I'm following you there, Sean. So you're saying, take the language that we just put in, copy that down to a 2.4 and leave 2.1 as it was previously written.
Mm-hmm. And then it's just a matter of selecting, you know, a COP that is slightly higher than the code minimum COP, which is listed in one of the tables. And it could even be a percentage, you know, percent higher than the COP required in table C403.3.2 parentheses 2. It's a little bit buried, but it's there.
Yeah, Kevin, so if I'm following what Sean is saying there, we would copy the remainder of 2.1 and copy it down to 2.4. And then, Sean, are you proposing that in this instance where the HSPF is not available, that COP would need to be higher than 1.75? Did I hear you correctly?
So the 2.2 and 2.3 are getting at kind of all season efficiency as opposed to just cold temperature efficiency. So you would just want to exceed the COP that's required by code by a minimum amount. Although you may decide that it's just not that important because you've got that cold temperature COP. That's kind of the critical thing for a cold climate heat pump.
I mean, I feel like getting 1.75 to 5 degrees makes sense. I mean, it's driving the designers away from heat pumps that basically shut off at 20 degrees or 30 degrees. And that's kind of the critical aspect, is getting a heat pump that functions down to close to our design temperature in Denver. So I feel good about the language that we put in 2.4.
Okay, so Ken has made a motion to add section 2.4 with the verbiage on the screen. Just for the sake of time, we won't vote on that yet. We'll see if there's any more changes and then move forward. So next hand up, Ken, if you're done. Ken, are you done with
One
your...
last item. I guess Sean put that language in the chat. And Sean, if I'm correct, is that the exception? Is that there's some proposed revised language for the exception just below the heat pump equipment?
That's the language that would align the exception with the ERV requirements for multifamily that Elizabeth was talking about.
I think that is an appropriate change to make. Kevin, so if we could add that to my motion.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
That's
Anything
it
else,
for
Ken?
me. Nope, I'm good.
All right, Elizabeth, you're up next.
Yeah, I do like these changes that are being proposed, but we are still, and again, kind of from the boots on the ground standpoint, you're going to have buildings that would technically meet the definition of an all-electric building that could not meet this requirement. What that makes me worried about is that if the building can't achieve these, and I should say, all electric space heating or all electric water heating, or whatever, that aren't going to be able to meet these standards. And the worry there is that if a building can't meet these, that they're not going to try to electrify, and we're going to get gas back on the project. If we make electrification too hard, is what I'm saying, we will have buildings that will go a different direction. I totally understand the point that trying to make this also limit the cost impact, but I'll also argue that does not exist in C407. That requirement to have these minimum ratings, that we could have an all electric project that doesn't have these requirements, that can follow C407 and comply just fine. So I don't love that we're penalizing these all electric projects that are just trying to do prescriptive compliance. And, if we're honest about it, those are the projects that are going to struggle to find equipment ratings that meet this. I mean, and those are the projects that probably aren't going to go performance route. And yeah, that's always a pathway, but it's the little projects with maybe not that fancy equipment that we're not going to have this data available, that are not going to be able to achieve that and might punt and go gas. So I get the point, but I don't think it aligns with the other compliance options. And I think you're going to have some unintended consequences if this goes as written. What I might suggest is to split this. Right now, C406.12, the description is all electric space heating. That's it. It doesn't say all electric space heating that meets a certain efficiency requirement. It just says all electric space heating. So if we really want people to go all electric space heating, give them at least some credit for going all electric space heating, even if it doesn't meet all the efficiency requirements of this credit. So that project that's got the, heat pump rooftop units and all of those things that are doing the right thing, but aren't going to be able to find this data, give them some credit for it, give them, a few points for doing that. And then the projects that do have the ability to find this documentation or to spend the money to add the energy recovery can get some extra credit for it. But if we don't provide at least a stepping stone to this level, it will be out of reach for many projects that would normally use this method.
So Elizabeth, would you like to make a motion to split that section 406.12?
Yeah, I think I would. If you could make it a two point threshold, and I will say I said this in the working groups too, so this is not new news. I don't love the restrictions that are put in here, and it's going to inhibit us in trying to get buildings off of gas. So I would suggest that we have a 2-level point threshold to this particular section. And again, you can decide what those point levels are, but give those projects that can actually be all electric. And I would keep the the limitations to electric resistance heat, because I think that makes a lot of sense. But in that first tier of this credit, I would remove everything in C406.12.2.
So your motion is to break out 406.12.1, the exception, from 12.2. Am I hearing that? Is that correct?
Yeah. And yeah, I think I am. I think trying to look at like how we did it for heating and cooling, and yeah, it would be probably 12.1 would be a certain number of points, and 12.2 would be a certain number of points. That I could still achieve the same level, but I think we've got to split those or it won't happen.
Okay, great. So there's two motions on the table there. Elizabeth, did you have anything else to add before I move on?
No, I think that's good. Thank you.
Okay, next up is subject matter expert John. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, real quickly, I agree with all the points made by others so far. And also to Sean's point, I think the key here is not so much trying to optimize this HSPF or the seasonal load, but trying to avoid the resistance heating at low temperatures. I think it will be a little bit of a challenge with the larger heat pumps. Now, the larger heat pumps do have ratings at 17 degrees outside temperature. They have a COP. So that might be something to consider, just trying to push that a little bit as far as maybe having a slight improvement over code minimum COP at 17 degrees for the larger heat pumps. I realize that kind of muddies the language potentially, but the HSPF won't be applicable for the larger heat pumps. That's it.
Thanks, John. Next up, we have Chuck.
Thank you. So I agree with a lot of what Elizabeth said, and I wanted to second that this was discussed in the working group to have a tiered point system for the all electric. And so I definitely support that modification to have a entry level electrification point. And then, if you do a high efficiency, you get some extra points for that. And then regarding the modification to the exception, so that is the copying code language that is for multifamily only. And so the other occupancy types will have a different minimum requirement per code. And currently we have that amended in the code. And there is another code proposal wanting to amend that performance requirements of section C403.7.4.2. So if the intent of the exception is just to have energy recovery based on minimum code requirements, I think we should just direct them to the right section instead of repeating the code requirements from another section. So I think, where a space is served by a heat pump with an outdoor air energy recovery ventilation system that meets section C403.7.4, that would cover the performance requirements for multifamily and for commercial, for other types of occupancies.
Okay, Chuck. So I'm gonna pose that over to Ken, since it was his motion via Sean's. Ken, would you want to update this exception down here to just state to see section 403.7.4?
Yeah, I think anytime that we can state things in one location, we're better off. So yeah, I'm okay with having it reference a different location.
Okay, great.
I'm
so
sorry,
Chuck,
I didn't I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand Chuck's suggestion. As Chuck, could you repeat that? As it had to do with multifamily?
Yeah, so the way that Sean's exception is it's specific to only multifamily. And my concern is that this section in general doesn't apply to just multifamily, it would apply to all commercial projects. And so if the intent of the exception was just, a heat pump partnered with energy recovery required by minimum code, let's just reference the section that has the performance requirements for energy recovery. And then within that section, it covers the performance requirements for multifamily and all other commercial properties.
Got it. Thank you. Sorry. Caught up.
Okay, no problem.
So Chuck, let me see if I'm typing this correctly. So it's we're at C comma C section C 403.7.4 and delete
Correct.
the rest. Is that what you're proposing? Okay. Okay, Sean, you're up next.
So I think there is a bit of an issue doing it that way because the requirements of C 403.7.4 are only for dwelling units. So that means that anything other than a non-transient dwelling unit automatically complies because it's not required to do ERV by that section, which is the reason that it was written the way that it was, because all of the ERV requirements in C 403 are conditional requirements. They are required in certain circumstances. And so when you refer to the kind of the functional requirements for ERV, they're all dependent on when it's required. So if it's not required, then you don't have to do it. So by referencing those sections, you are only requiring ERV for the exception where ERV is already required by code. And you're not picking up any of those additional circumstances where you would want to have ERV for that energy reduction for the heat pump. So that would just be the consequence of doing that, is referring to those sections for the exceptions doesn't actually do anything. It basically makes an exception for any building that already complies with what they have to do for ERVs because the code requires them to.
So if we want to cover all buildings, and I understand what you're saying, Sean, and I agree that, so in this exception, if we want to cover all buildings, we would need to specifically state the performance requirements of the ERV for multifamily and the performance requirements for all other commercial projects.
Either state it for multifamily and other commercial. The way that it's phrased right now, it's a little bit simpler. It just uses the performance requirements for multifamily for everything because they're a little bit lower, and that's a little bit cleaner. But you could say this is the ERV requirement for non-transient dwelling units. All other shall comply with the ERV requirements from the other portion of C 403, which I'm trying to find right now.
I suppose you could also just exclude non-transient dwelling units from this requirement. And that would accomplish the same thing.
Okay, so while people are digging into that, Ken, are you okay going back with the original language for the time being?
Yeah,
with the original motion to change that.
yeah, I'm okay with it. I'm kind of wondering if we should have both of those, both the part that we added and the part that you currently have hashed out, and maybe we just say multifamily for one and then all others the other. I don't know if that would satisfy what Chuck was driving towards.
My only concern would we would have a different requirement here for other than multifamily dwelling units than what would be in another proposed section or another proposed amendment that still hasn't been decided upon, which I believe that one is 60% energy recovery is what the proposed amendment. So I think if we stuck with 60%, I'm pretty comfortable with that across the board for heating.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead, Ken.
I guess that's okay. We've got 60% there now, so for heating.
Okay. So in the meantime, we'll move over to the next person, Courtney.
Thanks, Kevin. This relates back to this conversation, and I'm just trying to understand how it ties into the proposed modification that Elizabeth made. If we have them split into tiers, do we even need this exception? Because you could even just do a base heat pump for 12.1. Do you need the exception? And does that only tie to 12.2, or is it needed? I'm just trying to figure out if we need to even add this.
If I can pipe up, sorry. I think what I was suggesting is to have a 2-tier thing and to still include all the extra requirements here in 12.2 in that higher tier point threshold, but to have the 12.1 be the stepping stone or the entry level all electric. So I think it still makes sense to include for that second tier.
Okay.
If folks support that.
Okay, any other discussion before we call a vote on the motions? Seeing none, I'm going to split those motions up into 2 different ones, just because I feel like they're so different. So the first one we will go in order, which is Ken's motion, is to add section 2.4 under 406.12.2, and the language is here on the screen, in addition to modifying the exception language down there within that section. So I'm going to call a vote on that. But before I do, I just want to make sure we got the correct voting numbers on there. Charlie, do we still have 16 voting members?
There should be a 17 now. It looks like Nate is back on.
Okay. Okay, great. We will call a vote then. So all those in favor of approving those 2 modifications, please raise your hand. Okay, I see 14. Go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. 0. And all those abstaining, please raise your hand. 1. Okay, go ahead and lower your hands. Okay, so that passes. So now I will call a motion or a vote for the second motion, which is Elizabeth's motion. And this is to create 2 tiers or 2 sections, if you will, under C406.12. The first tier would be 406.12.1 with a point threshold, and the next section would be 406.12.1 with a separate point threshold. Now, those point thresholds are not decided at this point, but we will vote just to see if we wanted to split those up into 2 tiers, and then we can handle how we get those point systems, if we will. Any discussion before we call a vote on that motion? I see there is an attendee that, make sure that's not one of our people. Nope, it's not. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just suggest that in addition to the call out here for electric resistance heat, that we're just referring to heat pumps that meet the efficiency standards of table blah blah blah, so that it's still clear that yeah, all electric is great, but heat, the target here is heat pumps, and I don't know what the right words are here, but to just emphasize that yeah, all electric heat pumps with the bit of electric resistance heat. Then I think for 12.2, we want to make sure that 12.2 is still inclusive of 12.1. So I'm not sure what what the right language would be there, but just wanted to emphasize that that would be, both requirements. If that makes sense.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. And any other, is anybody confused about the motion? It's okay if you are. Okay, seeing no hands go up, I will call a vote for this motion to split sections 406.12.1 and 406.12.2 into two different thresholds, with 12.2 being inclusive to 12.1. All those in favor, please raise your hand. I see 14. Go ahead and lower your hands. You'll have a couple of hands up. I'm going to lower everybody's hands. Okay, all those opposed, please raise your hand. 0. And all those abstaining, please raise your hand. 2. Okay, so that passes. All right. So we probably need to discuss how those point thresholds are going to be established. If everybody's okay with having a working group establish that's already worked on this, I think that would probably be the most appropriate instead of spending time here trying to figure out a point system. So if someone wants to make a motion on how those points are established, now's the time to do so. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't going to make a motion, sorry, but I think a little bit of study needs to happen by that working group to find out how often you can get that data. Because if it's only 10% of the time, I think the point threshold needs to reflect that until the industry can catch up with getting that data. Are we going to even a project that meets these requirements? Can you get those numbers on that equipment? We have to do a lot of verification work, so I can tell you how many times we see it on typical project types, and it's not very often, honestly. Even when I think a heat pump is pretty darn good, it's still really hard to find that information. So I just want to make sure that the point threshold reflects the actual feasibility of the requirement as well as what the efficiencies are.
Okay, thank you. Sean?
By splitting this into two, that second part with the cold climate heat pump becomes fairly redundant with C406 the improved heating performance credit. So really, by splitting the two, what has happened is the credit value of this credit option has been degraded. And keep in mind that the proposal originally prevented you from claiming credit for above code heat pump performance. So you can just remove that. And then it's a fairly straightforward process of just what should the credit value be for this proposal now that it represents a lower level of performance.
Okay, so Sean, you're saying that this table, it's this table that would then be updated. Is that what I'm hearing?
So just the line item for C406.12 would be updated with lower values because it is now the credit option delivers a lower level of performance, and what was carved off in that second tier is already represented by C406.2, actually 0.3 is the one that it would align with. So you already have the opportunity to get credits for the additional efficiency.
Understood. Okay. So these values here would be lower, just so everybody knows, based on that that motion that just passed. So we still need to have a discussion on how those values are going to cut, those values in this row are going to be determined. We can't just leave that open. So anybody have any discussions, some thoughts, a motion? Do we want to leave it up to your peers, the subcommittee? Courtney, go ahead.
I was going to suggest a motion to have a small working group meet and discuss this, and anyone on the committee is available to join.
Great. Okay, there is a motion to have a subcommittee form to get these values. Anybody else? Is there a second? Ken, go ahead.
I'll second that.
Okay, great. So I'll call a vote. All those in favor of creating a subgroup to get those new values for section 406.12 on table C 406.1, please raise your hand. I see 14, go ahead, 15, go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. None, and all those abstaining, please raise your hand. I see 0. Okay. All right. So we have modified this proposal, hopefully to your liking. Does anybody want to make a motion to approve, or any other motions? Any other discussion on this proposal? Courtney, go ahead.
I make a motion to approve as modified during the meeting today.
Okay, great. There's a motion to approve as modified. Is there a second? Ken?
I'll second that motion.
Great. Any further discussion on this proposal? Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, does that mean we will not get to see a version to vote on for the final modified version?
The only thing that's going to be changed by the subcommittee is this one row right here on the screen for 406.12 on those point values. So a short answer would be no. You've put that in the hand of a subcommittee to do.
Can we look at what the 6.12 language looks like again? I didn't think we had approved a modification of that language that would limit that. Like, that doesn't look different to me. I mean, other than the red part,
So,
but
I dropped language in the
haven't made
chat
the changes.
that would reflect what the committee's talked about.
sorry, could you repeat that?
I dropped language in the chat that would reflect how I captured what the committee was talking about, making it just heat pumps with a limit on the total amount of electric resistance that you could have.
So with that, does that basically delete everything in 12.2?
It deletes everything in C406.12 and replaces it with this. Because that second tier would be handled up above in C406. Keep forgetting, I think it's 3. The additional efficiency for heating equipment.
Okay, so the 0.1 and the 0.2 just go away and are replaced with that little snippet. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out the process here to see a version with this. Like, did Kevin, do we need to put this in there and remove the other modifications that were made? It makes me a little nervous that we're approving something that's not on the not on the screen. Sorry, call me cynical.
Sure. So
I'm hoping to see a record of it in our PDF here.
Sure. So what Sean created is a little bit different than what we voted on or what you all had voted on. it would just break these two sections into what you all voted on, breaking this section into a voting column, and then breaking section 12.2 into a voting column.
I guess that's that's what I'm not clear on. Because I think you just said something different from what I just heard Sean say.
Right, and so that what Sean had put in the chat is a summation of what the result of your voting would capture. We can vote on that, but that's not what the committee voted on. The committee voted on keeping both of these sections, 12.1 and 12.2, and just breaking it up into two different sections. So although Sean did one thing further, we can't necessarily say that that's what the committee voted on.
So I guess that's what I mean. Can we see what that would look like before we vote on this? It seems too nebulous to me to vote on.
I don't know if that's helpful, but that's how I captured the motion to happen, is break those up into two sections. So these values would need to be changed. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that is, because what I was hearing Sean say was that 12.2 did not have a purpose anymore because, or it didn't have an impact or something, or it didn't have the same impact because of 406.2.3, sorry, the 10% heating improvement. But maybe I misinterpreted Sean. So you still meant keep both, but just a point or just change the point threshold for 12.2. And sorry, I just don't have the vision of what the end goal is going to look like, which makes me nervous to vote on something.
Sure, no, understandable. I'm glad you're speaking up. So we can, there is a motion in a second, but that's okay. We can continue the discussion. Sean, do you want to elaborate a little bit more on the text that you put in the chat for everybody? It has caused a little bit of confusion and maybe rightfully so. But I think if you can elaborate why section 12.2 has disappeared maybe, and maybe we vote on that new language instead of creating two sections within that table. It sounds like there's some confusion.
And Kevin, is it possible to put that language in here so that we can see how it works? I feel like if we vote on something, sure, we should see what the language looks like instead of just, oh yeah, the committee will take care of it.
Well, this is Sean cannot make a motion, unfortunately. He's not a voting member. So the language that he's typed in the chat is not a formal motion at the time. So I can put it up on the screen so everybody can see, but it is in the chat unless someone wants to make the motion to rewrite section 406.12.
I'm sorry, I'm just unclear about where that language goes and what happens to 12.1 and 12.2. And maybe everyone sees this but me, I'm sorry.
So the essential point that I was making is that by splitting C406.12 into two, then what is in C406.12.2 is for the most part redundant with what is already in C406 all the way at the top, C406.2.6, because that is a system that exceeds the federal minimums by more than 10%. And so because of that redundancy between those two line items, you could make the argument that it just makes sense to completely eliminate C406.12.2 and just let the 0.1 be C406.12 and then assign an appropriate level of credits to it, since it now does not have the same level of performance. It's a lower performing credit option. And someone who wanted to go beyond would then just utilize the existing C406.2.6.
I think you guys are saying two different things then. I am not understanding what the goal is now. So, you know, it sounded like, Sean, you just said that 12.2 would go away.
I'm just
it
actually, I'm just trying to provide information that if you split them, then C406.12.2 has an overlap with an existing credit option. Since it's no longer part of the all electric requirement, now what is left actually is already pretty much covered by C406.2.6. So I'm just saying that it becomes redundant if you split those two in two as the committee has chosen. So there doesn't really
would that redundancy not have existed already?
No, because the original C406.12 was requiring a higher level of, it wasn't just requiring all electric, it was requiring efficient all electric. And the language specifically precluded you additionally also getting credits from the high efficiency heating up above. So splitting C406.12 into two kind of has a couple of cascading consequences.
Could you expand on that more? I'm not understanding why, if I could have gotten C406.12.4 and C406.2.6 before, or could I not have achieved both of those before these modifications?
Before the modifications, C406.12 precluded you from getting credit from C406.2.2 and C406.2.4 because it was already requiring the efficiency that those required.
Well, I did not interpret C406 in that way. How would I have known that? So like if I got points from 406.12, I could not have gotten points for 2.6 or 2.3
Right.
or 2.1.
There was a sentence in C406.12 saying buildings utilizing this section shall not be eligible for credits from sections, and then it points above. C406.2, oh, I may have, it's the heating one, C406.2.1 and C406.2.3, the heating ones. Not, I think I may have misspoken and called out the cooling numbers before.
Is that in here somewhere? I'm sorry, I did not see that anywhere in this proposal. May I missed it. So that did not then include the greater than though, correct?
No, because you could have gone even farther above in that
Could
case.
have gone even farther above.
So the efficiency requirements overlapped 0.1 and 0.3, but were not as high as you can get under 0.5, or is it 0.6? The more than 10% for heating.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm a little slow today. I think I didn't quite follow that, but I'm with you now. So if we can then go, thank you for catching me up. If we can then go back to if we are then, you know, if we're still talking about a 12.1 and a 12.2, or if you're just saying we would adjust the point thresholds there in some way.
So we discussed that a subcommittee would adjust these point thresholds for 12.1 and 12.2.
But they would still both exist.
Correct.
So Sean, then the snippet that you wrote over for in the chat for 406.12, where would that fit?
That would completely replace C406.12, including 0.1 and 0.2.
So there wouldn't be a 12.1 and 12.2. There's just a 12.
Under this model. I tried to
let
capture
me
what I
intervene.
felt
Let me
like.
intervene a little bit, Sean.
Yeah, sorry.
Let me intervene real quick. So, Elizabeth, we got to keep a mindful aspect that Sean is a subject matter expert on this. And so he is not proposing changing any of that language. He is just providing info to the committee. So if the committee wanted to make a change, that would be the change of that. So currently the committee has voted to separate 12.1 and 12.2 into two different sections. If the committee takes Sean's subject matter expertise into account and we vote on it and it's approved, it would just be a 12.1 in this table. So hopefully that clears it up a little bit. So Elizabeth, I see you're still thinking. We do have another hand up. We have a motion and a second on the table. So we'll come back to you if you still have further questions, but let's move forward. Chuck, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks. This question is more for Sean and his proposed language. Your feeling is that it would replace most all the requirements in, or all the requirements in C406.2 or C406 12.2 would be covered in the C406.2.3 section. My question is, there's cold climate aspects and temperature ratings associated with C406 12.2. Should we include those or consider those? I mean, can we get rid of C406 12.2, or do we need to include some of those low temperature ratings in C406.23, for example?
You could create, and that's probably the one part that is missing, is that cold climate. If we look at other jurisdictions like Washington, what they did is they allowed cold climate heat pumps to be allowed as their high performance option, even though they had a lower HSPF than was required. So that's kind of the trade-off with the cold climate. You could allow a cold climate heat pump to get more credits than it would on its HSPF alone. So if you wanted to provide bonus credits for cold climate, that would be an option. If you wanted to preserve that kind of the incentivizing cold climates, but just the HSPF efficiency gains, those are covered under the existing credit options above.
Okay, next up is Caitlin.
So for C406.2.13 and just all of the heating ones, are those just for electric heating efficiencies? And does it say that somewhere? I might have missed it, but I wasn't sure if it's specified, since it's not specifying an all electric building there or all electric heating.
Those credit options are available for either heating, for either electric or gas heating equipment. It's just, gas has a natural limit to how much you can get while electricity is continuing to go up.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I was just thinking that maybe that would it confuse then when you're talking about overlap between that CO and C406.12. I don't know if that gets mixed up in there, because then I guess there's might be different point values to still having electric and improved efficiencies versus just improved gas efficiencies or something like that. But I don't know if that just confuses it more if they get combined.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or discussion before we call a vote for approving as modified? Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to ask that we wait to vote on this until we can see what this looks like. It just feels like this is still a really big unknown. And I don't want to have to vote no on this. I'd really rather vote yes, and I don't feel comfortable voting yes until we see what that looks like.
And you're talking about these values in the table?
No, I'm talking about the language of 406.12. That still feels really up in the air to me. If if that might have to change or go away. Or, you know, if there isn't a 12.1 and a 12.2 and it's just a 12, that's still just really unclear to me. So I'm not sure what I would be voting on here or approving.
Sure. So what we're voting on right now is as written on the screen is what you're voting on. Section 406.12 would not change. The only thing that will change is that table, the point value in the table.
A motion to table would take precedence though.
I'm sorry, Mark, did you have something to add?
I was saying a motion to table would take precedence.
Okay. So I mean, I don't know, following Robert's Rules of Order, there's a motion and a second, so they would have to withdraw their motion and second, I believe. If I'm incorrect, someone please speak up.
Yeah, it's yeah, there just seems to be so much conflicting stuff here. You know, 406.12.1 would that not be also allowed to take credit for more efficient heating? I think it should be able to. You know, if I can find a heat pump that has a better COP rating or a better HSPF rating than minimum federal efficiency standards, I think that building should get credit for it. And that all electric. I still think that you know, if 406.12.2, you know, if that one can't also take credit for it, that's fine. But I don't think that this is properly written for a two-tiered point threshold yet. I think it needs some work.
Okay,
I mean,
Courtney, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I'm just trying to kind of combine all the comments that I'm hearing. I'm wondering if we can keep the motion to split into two while allowing some redundancies to what I believe was Elizabeth's point of, like, you should be able to maybe get some more credit if you're doing a little bit further. It's not necessarily exactly the same. And then I'm not sure we have to go back and really rework it, because we would be voting on what we see on the screen. And I'm just trying to be mindful of time and the, you know, the amount of hearings we do have left. I just want to make sure that we're not saving this to the end, because we have a lot to get through as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure under Robert's Rules of Order, a motion can be postponed to another time. So that the motion would still stand. It'd still be a motion to approve, but the motion to table would take precedence until we'd set a time, as the time was when work group would get back with the revised table and the revised language. I think that's what's in order.
Okay, sure. So I'll defer, just because I'm not familiar with that. I'll defer to the city. Anybody from the city want to speak up on that, on how we move forward?
Yeah, well, so with respect to the language and potentially, you know, tabling the proposal, I will just acknowledge that we have this hearing and two others to remain, and it is not the city's intention at all to add additional proposals. So we would need to revise this language in a subgroup or a working group quickly to bring it back for the committee to hear the vote that's been, or to hear the motion that's been proposed and seconded. Just acknowledging that. The default at the end of the day, if when we get to 5 o'clock on the 26th of July, if we have not heard all proposals, or if we have tabled and not had an opportunity to come back to all proposals, then city staff team members within our different and respective departments will take into consideration the committee's discussion and proposals and information, and then make a decision on the code language to move forward. So I'm fine with tabling this for the group to work on and coming back to it. We just need to be prepared as a committee to take action on this when it does come back.
Okay, great. So there's a motion to approve as modified in a second, but there is a motion to table that motion, which apparently takes precedent over it. So I will call a vote. All those in favor of tabling the motion to approve in the second until the subcommittee has looked at this and is brought back to this committee, or in default would be up to the city to make a decision on that if it's not done in a timely manner. That's what we're voting on. Chuck, I see your hand up. Do you have any discussion before we vote?
Nope, I jumped.
Okay, that's all right. All those in favor of tabling of all that I just said, please raise your hand. I have 14. Go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. At 0, and all those abstaining, please raise your hand. I have 1. Okay. So that motion has been tabled. However, we still need to talk about a date to have this come back. We have 2 dates left, the 19th and I think it was the 27th, something like that. And then we also need to see if anybody who wants to be part of that subcommittee. So all those that want to be a part of the subcommittee, please raise your hand and we'll take note. Just for record, we have Courtney, Elizabeth, Chuck, anybody else? Alan, and that's all I have. John, Jamie / Caitlin. All right, go ahead and lower your hands. And we'll just say that it's going to be sometime on the 19th, or I think it was I can't remember, 25th or 27th, one of the next 2 hearings. And if it doesn't get done by then, just know that it does get defaulted to the city to make that decision based on the discussion. All right, a little time check here. We'll take let's say like a 7-minute break. I'll put a timer up on the screen and we'll see you guys back then. Feel free to turn your cameras off for the time you're taking the break. Okay, if you can hear my voice, let's start getting back, turning our cameras on so we can get to the next item. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully we got a good refresh there. We're on item P19, and Taylor, I believe this is your proposal. If you want to give us a brief summary of this, feel free. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, Kevin. I'm going to start us off again, actually, since we brought this to the working group. So I'll go ahead and just share who was in the working group, and then Sean and Taylor are going to tag team walking through the proposal for the sort of 10 minutes here at the beginning. Just so that everyone has context on what happened in the working group. We want to share that with all of you so that you don't have to sort of rehash that, and you sort of understand the process the working group went through. So here on the screen, you can see who was participating in this working group. The working group met 4 times as a larger group, and there were several other times between meetings that they met to hone in on details. But participants included Group 14, Energetics, NREL, ME Engineers, and Ambient Energy. And before we dive into this proposal, I just want the committee to understand that the working group is recommending 3 modeling proposal paths. So the PEUI path, of course, started as a public proposal from Group 14. And we heard a really strong desire in the, there are 3 paths. The first one we'll hear is the PEUI. That will be followed by Appendix G with an energy cost baseline that's modified to align with Denver's goals, which will be followed by an Appendix G proposal based on site energy that better enables electrification. So here's where we're going to start, is with the PEUI proposal, which started as a public proposal from Group 14. In the working group, we heard a really strong desire from all of the energy modelers in the working group to have this PEUI proposal move forward, since it aligns the language and goals with Energize Denver, which sets energy use intensity performance requirements for existing buildings. And I'll just note across all 3 of these pathways, none of them guarantee buildings will be in compliance with Energize Denver, since they don't determine how a building is operated, but all 3 pathways are designed to set buildings up for success with the Energize Denver requirements. So the PEUI working group really took lessons learned from Boulder and adapted the proposal by adding mixed use occupancy types, certification requirements for energy modelers. I'll also note that we refined Denver modeling rules and procedures, which are as a policy document that will not go into code. Therefore, it will not be discussed or voted on today, but you have that set of rules and procedures for your reference in an email from me on June 24th. So with that, I'll pass it to, I think Sean's going to start the explanation of this proposal.
Yeah, so Kevin, if you'd allow me to share, that might be the easiest way to walk through this. Although I think I am allowed now that Katrina's not anymore. There we go. All right. So let me make sure I am sharing the right one. All right. Can you see that all right? Okay, I'm seeing nodding heads. So as Katrina said, this was brought as a proposal from Group 14. The city had actually been working up a proposal for target-based energy modeling based on the approach that was used in Boulder that was developed by NBI. And then, so we brought those 2 approaches together and moved it out of C407 and into an appendix just for clarity, so that our modeling paths can be distinct and clear and easy to understand for users. And that's why it has the appendix PT, performance target. It's not lettered in order. It's given one that's a little bit more evocative. I do want to point out that it does have a mandatory requirements section that points to C407.2. This is something that you will see in the Appendix G proposal. This is a set of mandatory requirements for all the modeling paths to really keep them consistent with each other in all of the ways that they can be. And then you can see that there are the modeling targets, and that it's only for certain occupancy types. And this is for a couple of reasons. These are the occupancies that have a little bit more consistent performance outcomes under Energize Denver's data analysis of the actual performance of Denver buildings. And so since they are a little bit more consistent, it is you can more reliably set performance targets for them. And it's why it's only limited. So this would be a limited path. And we also added an allowance for parking garages. And this also aligns with the allowance that's given for parking garages in Energize Denver. The working group really didn't want to exclude buildings that have integrated parking garages because they felt that this would benefit, that those buildings would benefit from this as well. Taylor's going to go into more on how those targets were set, so I'll let him cover that part. But moving down, you'll see that we have the renewable energy cap here, again at 10%. Of course, a building can have more, but they can only claim the credit for 10%. And this is to be consistent across the board of all the compliance paths. And if we go back up, we do have this relationship to Energize Denver. And this is something that Katrina mentioned and the working group felt was important to include. This isn't an actual requirement. It really is just informative. And it's to really draw the project team's attention to the fact that these buildings will be subject to Energize Denver. Now, for the people we had on the working group who are well established in the Denver market, this is not such a big deal. But the working group was cognizant of the reality that firms from outside of Denver or who are not as familiar with the Denver market could be coming in, and it would be important to draw their attention to this connection between the two, and to the owners, as they're seeing these projects, drawing their attention to it too. So you'll see that this doesn't actually require anything, but it does provide that informative link. So with that, we are going to hand it over to Taylor to talk a bit more about target setting.
Thanks, Sean. So NBI had done a lot of investigation into the different building types and their performance target using the prototype buildings and different code cycles. So we took that and compared it to Energize Denver. And obviously we wanted new construction to be more stringent than Energize Denver. So we actually took 10% off the Energize Denver targets. And then we used whichever one was more stringent. So the idea was that we wanted to make sure that the Energize Denver path, 10% better than Energize Denver path, wasn't easier than any of the other code pathway options. And we also wanted to make sure those prototype buildings weren't easier or too hard using those compared to real world buildings. So that's how those were derived.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Taylor. I think Sean, if you want to stop sharing, I think Taylor, it might also be helpful if you speak to some of the models you ran for sample buildings, and I have a slide just to show that as context before the committee dives into discussing this PEUI proposal. I think it would be helpful for the committee to see you walk through the sample buildings that both you and Elizabeth, and this was sent to the committee as an attachment, but Taylor, do you want to just walk through this so that folks can understand the samples?
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. This is really helpful. I think, a big part of the PEUI pathway was Energize Denver and aligning with that with clients, and just everyone's talking about EUIs right now. I think the other big part of it, right, is just to ensure that there's multiple pathways so that if a project has some weird requirements or what have you, there's a pathway for it to comply reasonably with energy code. So I think from a high level, looking at these projects and just looking at the three pathways, we support having those three pathways for that reason. Just because some building types and different things lend to the different pathways. And I think it does from a really high level, before I dive into building by building, you can kind of see, short descriptions of the buildings. And if it passes or fails, most of these projects were from Boulder, just because Boulder currently has Appendix G modeling requirements. So we had that baseline. But I think the key here that you can see, the takeaway for the PEUI is you can actually see it's the hardest, which is kind of by design, right? It's a new pathway. I think the city's concerned about reviewing those. And there's a lot of concerns with that. So I think it by design and good that it does look like it's one of the hardest pathways, but it's available and there. So that's good. And then I'll kind of just dive through here really quick. And if people have questions, they can ask those. But essentially, this first one, all electric multifamily, right? Not amazing as far as the equipment, but definitely good. Electric resistance, hot water heaters, and then low ambient heat pumps serving that. And then to meet Boulder's energy code, basically filled their roof with PV. On top of that, I left the PV out of the analysis just because I didn't think that was super helpful, and it would be capped at 10% anyways. So it failed the PEUI target, it failed Appendix G, and it passed Appendix G site energy. What that really speaks to, right? PEUI target is still pretty difficult, even if you're all electric. Appendix G, the straight Appendix G pathway really favors gas buildings, even with, and Sean can get into this later, but the two all electric or not, it really favors all gas buildings. So that fails. The Appendix G site energy is really the inverse of that. It really favors mostly electric or all electric buildings. So we got to pass there. If we go down to the next one, this is like a direct opposite, I guess you could say, of that first one. It's an all gas multifamily, right? So Aquatherm with gas, domestic hot water heaters, individual 80%. And again, it's using a ton of PV actually to pass in code in Boulder, but we left that out. So it wasn't even close on the PEUI target, obviously being gas. It does pass Appendix G, and then it fails the site energy. So that kind of shows you, again, Appendix G straight just favors gas buildings. I would note, I think some of the other electrification requirements would probably make that system not allowed if they pass. So, but it is to note that, right, that building would technically pass under Appendix G, if not being not required for other reasons.
And Taylor, I might jump in and ask you just to kind of pull out a couple other highlights and take questions, because then we were asked to keep our total intro to 10 minutes. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, really the other highlights, right? Again, mixed fuel building, Appendix G works better. I think some takeout, a lab didn't pass at all, but it was really close with the site energy. So it could have got there. It didn't, but a small PV system or just some improvements would do. Elizabeth had some interesting results from a all electric office, right? It passed the EUI and the site, again, not Appendix G. And then finally, she had a 24/7 fast food restaurant, which was difficult to pass anything, but there was at least a pathway through the Appendix G. So that's kind of high level. Just nice to have those three pathways as different projects and their systems lend different ways.
Thanks, everyone who introduced that. Let me ask real quick for that group that introduced the proposal. Would it be beneficial to hear P19, number 18, and number 20 all together Or, okay, I'm seeing here, it's shake no.
Oh, I think we've decided they should be heard independently, but we thought some of this information was helpful context before you start hearing all three of them.
Okay, understood. All right, so we will, let me get this back up on the screen, and we will go to the general public. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. Mark, go ahead and introduce yourself again, and you'll have 2 minutes to speak.
Hello, Mark Jelinski, RMH Group. I'm going to primarily talk about the the enforceability of this and make sure that the language works well for the city. Looking at the table PT 103, first of all, I understand that the intent is intended to be limited, so I do understand that. But perhaps the descriptions of these, it's a little confusing. In other words, you put in apartment and then you say R2. Do you mean all of R2 or specifically apartments? You know, hotel, same thing with hotels, all of R1 or just hotels? Group B offices, there's an awful lot of Group B that's not an office. The descriptions in the building code talk about, dormitories in the Rs. There's a different word for hotel versus motel within the building code. So does this specifically exclude a motel? So be careful of that. I understand why you're trying to limit it to these relatively simple. I think what you're intending is, like apartments, but what about condos? Why would the form of ownership of that unit have a relationship here? Be careful with this. I think that you have potential to create some if not unintended consequences, certainly a lot of confusion with, well, what do you really mean by apartment R2, and does my dormitory comply?
Okay, thank you, Mark. Anybody else from the general public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support? Being no more, I'm going to lower hands. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition of this proposal, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody wants to speak in opposition? Being none, we'll go back to the committee. Committee, this is your time to ask questions to the proponent. Does anybody have any questions about this proposal? Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, real quick. Mark brought up a good comment there, and I guess I would ask the committee to kind of touch on the specifics of the generic description, like apartment, and then how it also says R2. What's the intent there?
Sure, so that would go to the proponent. So we got a combination of Katrina, Sean, Taylor. Any of you want to take that one? Elizabeth, I know you were part of that as well.
Yeah, Sean, can you? I don't really know.
Yeah, the intent was to provide clarity because the occupancy types are so clearly defined in IBC, but Mark is right, they are broader than these narrower words that are used as well. So if the committee feels that that is an obstacle to clarity, then just removing those broader occupancy types could address the point that Mark brought up. You might change apartment to multifamily so that it's clear that it's not just rental, it's also owner, because condos are just apartments you own.
Okay. Any other questions? Third and final call, questions from the committee. Elizabeth.
Yeah, Taylor, do you mind, this isn't really a question because I've read it, but I'm not sure if everyone has, how the proposed modeling rules would apply to generating the EUIs and stuff. And that, I guess that would go like the schedules and any documentation there that you think might be relevant? Because whenever we talk about modeling to a performance target, different modelers might apply different standards there. And I think you guys did a great job of writing some of that out as far as kind of leveling the playing field and taking some of those things equivalently. And then I have a couple of questions there as to, if a team feels like they need to deviate from those rules, do we have enough flexibility in there that it's, I guess, easy to adjust when it makes sense, I guess.
Yeah, so Elizabeth is referring not to this document, but to the document referenced by this, which is the Denver Modeling and Rules and Procedures. I don't know exactly what it's called, but that modeling document, which really outlines a lot of information. It's similar to Boulder's, but it gives schedules and equipment power densities and that type of thing as kind of the base. So if you wish to go above that, if you think they're not accurate and that they're too low, you can go above that and just state that in your report. That's totally allowed. If for whatever reason you feel like they're too high or your building has something specific, you can change those. It just has to be approved by the code official. So there's the language in there about if you go above, you're fine, just document it. If you go below and you're reducing these, it needs to be approved. So that's kind of that process. I think a few other key items in there, right, are like what documentation you have to provide. So it does ask for full modeling outputs to provide to the city. Again, I think that was a request of the city for this pathway. And it also looks at like taking into some altitude, making sure you're taking into altitude and derating for gas equipment, et cetera.
All right, Elizabeth, any more questions? I see your hand still up. Okay.
No, thank you.
Chuck, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just hoping to get a clarification of why the modeling rules were not included in the proposal to update the Denver building amendments and purposely put as a policy document.
So I can answer that. It came down to the fundamental reality that this is a new modeling code approach for Denver, and Boulder is the only place that we've seen this before. And so there was the desire to ensure that the modeling rules and procedures had the potential to be modified in response to the needs of the market or in response to the needs of the city in terms of enforcement and administration. That just, if it's in the code, then it takes an act of city council to make those modifications. But if it's in a policy document, it can go through a different set of procedures and it can be more nimble and more responsive to both the city's needs and the market's needs. And your policy documents do have a process for revising, so we don't have to worry about pernicious revisions since policy documents do have to go through a process for revision.
Okay. All right, seeing that there are no more questions, we will go back to the general public. Anybody who wants to speak in rebuttal and support, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to have a rebuttal and support, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody that wants to have a rebuttal and support, please raise your hand. Seeing none, and seeing there was nobody that spoke in opposition earlier, we go back to the committee for discussion or to make a motion. Anybody from the committee have anything that they want to discuss, or if anybody wants to make a motion? Courtney.
Thanks, Kevin. I would like to address the comments about the occupancy types. So I guess I want to make a motion to approve with the modifications, like removing the occupancy types per code, like R2, and replacing that with multifamily. For hotel, I think we can say hotel and motel and remove R1. I think, and then I think the rest can remain as is. or I'm sorry, office, let's remove group B. And then keep retail, restaurant, bar, and parking garages.
Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
Okay. There's a motion to modify, to approve, Courtney, did you say approve with the modifications? Is that what your motion was?
Correct.
Okay. There's a motion to approve with the modifications of those three on the screen. Is there a second?
I'll second. It's Elizabeth.
Okay, Elizabeth seconds. Any discussion before I call a vote? Chuck?
So I just had a question about the restaurant bar with 175. Is the intent to capture occupancies that have food service, or could a bar like a tap house that doesn't have food preparation on site, was it intended to include that as well? Was it intended to capture the kitchen energy use, essentially?
Yeah, the intent of both the retail, restaurant, bar, and parking garage is just that most, like multifamily or office projects in Denver will have first floor retail for street frontage. So trying to capture that so you can do a weighted average. Chuck, I think that's a good question. I mean, it could potentially, you could slightly game it there. It's probably not going to be very much of the building. But the idea is that typically too, at that time, they don't know what's going in there. They just know if they're making the retail for like mercantile or like kitchen, and they're providing for kitchen. So at the stage, we'd most likely be modeling it as a generic restaurant.
Thank you, Taylor.
Okay, any other questions or discussion before I call a vote? And okay, seeing none, I will call a vote. The motion is to approve this with the modifications of taking out R2 under apartment and putting multifamily, taking out R1 and putting motel next to hotel, and taking out group B. So you're voting to approve this proposal with an addition to those modifications. All those in favor, please raise your hand. The 11, go ahead and lower your hands. Hands are down. All those opposed, please raise your hand. 0, and all those abstaining, please raise your hand. 4. Okay, thank you. So this proposal passes. Thank you all for that. We will move on to the next one, which is item number 18. I'm going to start with Sean, I guess. Are you going to introduce this one?
I'm going to do a very brief introduction on each of these that the working group covered.
Okay.
So if I can steal the
Okay.
screen share.
Yep.
Just to give people a sense of the working group process. I won't repeat. You all know who is in the modeling working group, but I just thought I would touch here on this proposal on a little bit of sort of reflecting on the discussion that was had. So we heard from you all that this proposal needed more vetting and stakeholder input. So it was moved to the same energy modeling working group. What the group did was simplify the requirements, the targets, and the equations. We heard support from the energy modeling group working group for this proposal, but that they also want site energy and PEUI options. And this proposal keeps an energy cost baseline, which does favor gas. The site energy proposal will be an additional option that incentivizes all electric. So that's the next proposal you'll hear. So now I'll pass it to Sean to share the proposal itself.
Right. Let me bring up the appropriate one. So, oh. So the first thing to note is that we do have this language that we saw elsewhere clarifying what an all-electric building is and ensuring to allow that use of emergency power. I don't think we need to go into that. This does, as a reminder, for those who may not have seen it before, this does completely replace C407 with an application of Appendix G. It makes some modifications to Appendix G to make it work for Denver and to align it with Denver's energy goals. I think the really important thing to keep in mind here is that from the last time that you've seen this, this is substantially simplified to really make it easier to use for modelers in Denver. And if we go down to this section, you'll see that as we discussed before with C406, that we did have this, aligning this better with the way that these different building types are discussed in Appendix G to just keep that alignment. You will see that there is a column for all electric properties and a column for all other buildings. These building performance factors are how how Appendix G adjusts stringency. And I want to note two things about this that I think that is really important. The first is that as the modeling working group was discussing, there was the desire, the original Denver target adjustment factor that applied to the whole building energy use kept becoming an issue because it would require energy reductions in regulated energy to get additional energy reductions in regulated energy to get energy reductions from the unregulated energy. And so not only did introducing that factor into the process create more complex code language, but it also created this stringency issue. So by simplifying and just using the equations in Appendix G as they are and only adjusting the BPFs, what that does is it simplifies it. It makes Denver's use of Appendix G look more like the standard use of Appendix G. And then it also only requires the energy savings from the regulated loads, which makes it easier to navigate through this process. If we go back up, you'll see that it does highlight the relationship to Energize Denver, just like we saw before. So always keeping this in mind. It also has a section for prerequisites. And there's a couple of things that are noted here. It still has the table C407.2, which has sections from the main body of the code that are required. This is to capture the things that Denver has done to make them mandatory. So this is the demand responsive water heating and the electrical vehicle charging infrastructure. It does require the disclosure of the PUI, just like before, to create this connection, even though it's not based on PUI. It also requires the disclosure of the Energize Denver target that will be applicable to the building. So we want to create that really close connection, and it points them to where you will get that target. It requires that the modeling be done under the supervision of a professional who holds the ASHRAE Building Energy Modeling Professional Certification. And the working group discussed this issue of the city can ensure quality models in two ways. One is to create more specific requirements for the modeling itself, and the other was to create standards for the modelers. And the working group very much leaned toward creating standards for the modelers so that they could have that set of professional standards to ensure that projects were getting good models and not just completely leaving it up to modeler discretion, but making sure that the modelers did have discretion in their models. And by having this professional certification, the city can be more confident about the accuracy of those models. And then these last two are, they replace mandatory requirements that are in ASHRAE 90.1 that are referenced from Appendix G, but have similar requirements in the IECC. So one of those are the requirements for energy monitoring. So that's C405.12. And then the other one is commissioning or acceptance testing, which is C408. So this replaces the ASHRAE requirements with the IECC requirements, just so that there are consistency across the compliance paths, whether you're modeling or prescriptive. The city will see the same kind of energy monitoring and the same kind of acceptance testing. This has been brought up in previous cycles about people choosing the path based on things that have nothing to do with the actual stringency level. And there is one last thing to note about the BPFs. So the all-electric properties, these BPFs are the standard BPFs for ASHRAE 90.1. So just like in C406, where we allowed a all-electric building to just comply with the model code, this allows an all-electric building to just comply with the model code. However, if you're looking closely, you'll note that these BPFs are different than the 90.1 2019 BPFs that you had seen before. And that's because ASHRAE is using a different methodology to calculate BPFs in ASHRAE 2022 than it did in 2019. And the result is sometimes those BPFs are, in one case, they're less stringent. In most cases, they're less stringent. In one case, they're more stringent, but they are more accurate. So the working group really wanted to capture the benefit of that. So PNNL, who is the Pacific Northwest National Lab, they are the ones who generate these BPFs for ASHRAE. They shared with us what the BPFs for 2019 would look like if you use the 2022 methodology. So I hope that's clear. The big thing here is that most of them are actually a little bit lower because they're more accurate. And then the BPF for all other buildings, we've only applied that Denver target adjustment here. So you can see now the difference between all electric and mixed fuel, but you don't have to worry about actually applying that Denver target adjustment anywhere. It's all done ahead of time here in the BPFs. And I think the only other thing to mention is that this also includes the 10% cap on renewable energy, and that's here. In 2019, I think it's 2019, ASHRAE introduced a 5% cap, but because Denver's goals are a little bit more ambitious, the working group wanted that cap raised but didn't want to allow too much trade-off between fundamental efficiency and renewable energy. So it's capped at 10% instead of the 5% that's as part of Appendix G. So I think we have just a couple of words from Taylor as one of our committee members, our working group members.
I think Taylor had to hop off, so.
Oh, he did.
Yeah, we'll just move on to committee.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction. We will go over to the general public. General public, anybody that wants to speak in support of this proposal, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. I was going to say third and final call, but Mark, your hand went up. Go ahead, Mark. You'll have 2 minutes.
Hi, thank you, Mark Jelinski, RMH Group. Again, just review the building types, right where you're at exactly. It's on one hand, you're being specific with offices, and then you say Group B. Well, what about college classrooms? Continue on. There's several other places that you could warehouse, okay, but not all Group S's are warehouses necessarily. What's the definition of a warehouse? School, Group E, well, about a Group B school. Just be careful with that and try to address that and make it followable and enforceable.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Third and final call, anybody that wants to speak in support from the general public, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we'll go to opposition. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Anybody from general public that wants to speak in opposition of this proposal, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we'll go back to the committee. Committee, this is your time for questions. Anybody have any questions of the proponent? Second call for any questions from committee members. Seeing none, I'll go back to the general public. Mark, do you want to have a rebuttal and support? Or anybody else from the general public? Like it. Mark, you'll have 1 minute. Go right ahead.
And an addendum, I guess. Healthcare hospital is probably the biggest generalization in all of that. Again, how is healthcare, the word healthcare addressed in the code? It really isn't. I'd say the vast majority of what falls into healthcare is actually a B occupancy, right? Just an office building with some fancy equipment in it. So just, again, be careful to keep it followable and enforceable.
Okay, thank you. Third and final call for anybody who wants to have a rebuttal and support from the general public. Seeing none, I'll go back to the committee. Our subject matter expert, his hand is up first. John, why don't you go ahead?
Sorry, hitting the wrong icon. Yeah, I mean, I support this. I just have one clarification or question. You mentioned that the PEUI should be calculated, determined for this approach. Does that mean that they'll have to do 2 sets of models? In other words, are the modeling procedures the same for this the ASHRAE Appendix G and this other PEUI?
So they won't need to use the Denver rules and procedures for modeling because that is for the energy target approach. They will just need to report whatever gets kicked out of their simulation software. So all the simulation software generates an EUI, they just have to report it. And it uses that definition of PEUI that is above so that it's pretty clear. I'm not aware of any modeling software that doesn't generate an EUI for you. So you would just follow the modeling methodology of Appendix G to generate that PEUI, and you would just get it from the software.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, committee, this is now your time to have discussion, or if you feel strong enough, you can make a motion. Elizabeth.
Yeah, so since I was part of the working group, I'll try to answer a couple of those questions. Mark, to your question first, I think your comments are right on. I was just looking at how the building types are described, because we pulled this right out of ASHRAE 90.1. And ASHRAE 90.1 does not have the references to R2, R1, Group B. I would suggest we just remove those group references to align with ASHRAE, basically just as we did with the PEUI. I think that's appropriate because your comments are right on. And then within that, we just defer to ASHRAE. And there's, wealth of information as to how we would define those so that we're not conflicting with what those descriptions are. So I guess I'll propose that. And then to answer John's questions about the PEUI, you could absolutely, if you follow the rules and regs for our standard, for those modeling requirements, you conceivably could evaluate a project within both compliance methodologies, applying just all those standard schedules. But this allowance, if those schedules don't make sense, or if your building's just different, you could certainly deviate from that and use this methodology. If your methodology, as Taylor noted, that was kind of my question to Taylor about those rules and regs. If your methodology, your schedules, your set points are more aggressive, then the modeling rules, I believe we would also be permitted to use that for the PT, that performance target methodology. So we could evaluate both within that scope. Those are just kind of setting those minimum requirements as far as energy usage, but we would be allowed to go above and beyond that. So I don't anticipate having to create 2 different sets of models.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, you're making a motion to strike out all the things in parentheses in the table of C407.3, is that correct?
I am, yeah, that does now align exactly with how ASHRAE described it. I think Mark's comment is appropriate.
Okay, great. Is there Before I go to Eric, is there a second on that? Or maybe Eric is the second.
I was going to
Okay.
second. Yeah.
Okay, great. Any other discussion or any other motions? Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'll just add a few comments because I was one of the naysayers about this methodology in the first place. And the two kind of big objections that I had is that this methodology, even with the column here for all electric properties, I think the analysis that Taylor and I had done to evaluate how do our all electric buildings perform under this, they still don't look good under this. But we do have the other option that we're about to look at for site energy, and there is a path for compliance for those projects under that. So that kind of takes away that concern for me. My other big concern is, as the energy consultant, how do I tell my teams, how to design? Under the C407 methodology, it's pretty easy to say, hey, we just got to get 15% savings. We got to get 24% savings. That got complicated when we put on, an extra factor, and we're trying to reduce regulated loads on top of the unregulated loads. And it's been a major challenge for Boulder projects. So by eliminating that extra factor, and now just looking at our building performance factors, it's fairly easy now for us to go to our teams and say, okay, for multifamily, if we're all electric, this building performance factor of 0.78, that just means we have to reduce our regulated loads, HVAC lighting, water heating by 22%. That's something that people can visualize. They know what that means. They know how to, go after that. And same for, if it's a gas building, you have to reduce those costs by now 33% or 34%, I guess it is. So this becomes still a tangible metric that can be explained without us having to do that initial modeling to figure out what are those unregulated loads and what is that magic number, because that is a challenge for the Boulder projects. And I think getting rid of that and just kind of taking these two columns here makes that easy for everyone to understand. So my major concerns when we first saw this proposal have been eased, so I appreciate that.
Thanks for sharing. Chuck, you're up next.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to echo Elizabeth. Yeah, my bigger concern was the factor being applied to unregulated loads and how that would impact buildings and the equity across the spectrum of buildings. And the fact that we're now aligning this proposal much more closely with Appendix G, the way it's adopted at the national level, I think that's a huge step forward for Denver. My specific question, and I guess clarification, so I heard Sean say that pretty much the program would kick out a EUI for a project. However, the proposal is very specific in requiring a PEUI as dictated by a very specific document created by our CASR team. And to me, those are two very different things. And I'm just quite asking, is CASR reviewing this number, or is this going to be part of the review of the city of Denver? And has anybody looked at all the requirements in that specific CASR document for creating a PEUI? And how closely does it align to Appendix G requirements? Because Appendix G has quite a few requirements, but the schedules are less important because it's a comparative model.
Right, so the PEUI requirement is only for the modeled EUI. And so that's defined, that's what gets kicked out by the software. Then in addition to that, there is a requirement for the target EUI required by Energize Denver. Now, it references this document, the rules and regulations governing Energize Denver building energy performance requirements. For most buildings, that will simply be, you go to a table, you find the EUI in the table, and you drop it in your document. Because it's, in most cases, it's just the EUI from the document. There are situations where Energize Denver allows for modifications to that EUI. And so the document does lay out how and when those modifications can be made. Right now, they're fairly limited, Swimming pools is the big example. But if they do expand, then that might create modifications. So really think of this as you're reporting two EUIs. You're reporting the EUI from the model, and you're reporting the EUI that the building will be subject to under Energize Denver.
Okay, so I guess that still is my question. So we have two, I understand where the two EUIs come from, but the one that is going to be subject for Energize Denver, and who, I guess we're putting a specific document and requirements in our building code amendments that the building department or CPD doesn't have authority over. And I guess I'm curious, are we reviewing that EUI, that second EUI, to verify the accuracy of it? Or is the CASR team reviewing the accuracy of it?
Chuck, do you mean the target, the modeled EUI, or do you mean the one that we're pulling out of the Energize Denver requirement?
Yeah, so the one that's pulling out of the Energize Denver, if like Sean said, if they're not pulling just one that's prescriptive out of a table from Energize Denver, and they're using the whatever exceptions to modify that EUI, like, and I guess this maybe isn't even a discussion that should be had now, but I'm just curious about enforcement. Like, is that something CASR is reviewing, or is that something that the building department is now becoming experts on and reviewing?
Yeah, Chuck, I think we can figure that out offline after the fact. I think that it's a pretty simple number to pull from the rules, but we can figure out the process on that, because the Energized Denver team is going to want to know these EUIs as a baseline for the building. So we'll need to be getting that information. So I think we can figure that out as an internal study process, though.
I think I can add a little more info to that. And that's, as far as enforcement goes, Chuck, you could conceivably have a building that has a predicted EUI that is higher or worse than the Energized Denver targets, and that is currently permitted under the way that the code is written. Obviously, we'd rather not, but it is allowable. So I think the intention there in reporting it in our energy code compliances is partly to bring awareness, and then also partly for that reporting. So we've been including that predicted EUI in our models for this whole last code cycle since the 2019 Denver building code. So we're all kind of used to it. So we're just adding now kind of one other number here that shows, okay, well, here's what the actual target's going to be when this building becomes an existing building. And I don't know that you guys have to worry about that too much. And Katrina, tell me if I'm saying that incorrectly, but at least that's my impression.
I think that's exactly right, Elizabeth. And there may be a valid reason that some particular building is higher than the rules, because there are some non-standard building types where Energized Denver will adjust the target after the fact, and they will have processes for that, right? So this is just to raise awareness. This isn't, and we can figure out our internal processes on that later. But
okay, thanks. That helps.
Thank you.
Okay,
Chuck,
so we're not setting an
follow-up?
can I just get a clarification? So we're not setting a baseline that will be used by Energized Denver. The Energized Denver is a completely agnostic process to the approved building plans. Is that correct?
Energized Denver will refer to this as a baseline, but then they also have discretion, because there are just buildings that are unusual, to adjust the baseline, to adjust the target in a way that's appropriate for that building. So they will take this baseline into consideration, and they're writing all those processes to lay out those details now.
I think the fundamental important part for this is that this is only a documentation requirement. So no matter what EUI target gets reported in the documentation, there is no code compliance consequence of it. It is just merely, did you document it? Did you not? And if it misses, then the owners will hopefully see that in their construction documents, or at least have the opportunity to, but the design team will at least see that. But in terms of actual enforcement consequences, there aren't any. Document it, and once it's there, the requirement's been fulfilled.
Thanks, Sean. That clarification helps me be at ease. But yeah, overall, I'm very comfortable with the Appendix G. This was the one thing that was kind of gave me a little heartburn this morning when I read it over. And so, Sean, I appreciate that clarification.
All right, next up, we have Caitlin.
Yeah, I guess just in reference to all that, if you kind of, because with this Appendix G method, you're not using the proposed modeling guidelines that were for the target model, right? Those are just applied to the target model.
You don't have to.
Yeah.
You could if you wanted to, but no, you're not required to.
So should you be kind of referencing somewhere when you put what your target or what Energized Denver is going to require? If you think you have an irregular building or you think that your schedule is irregular or something like that, should you be including that information somewhere? Because maybe your EUI is higher in the model and it's higher than the Energized Denver target, but you think that it should be for whatever reason. Should that be part of your documentation?
I can give my opinion. I'll just give my opinion that I don't think that it's necessary. The intent of the working group really was just to ensure that project teams were thinking about the implications of Energized Denver, not that any of this would create any kind of enforcement ramifications. Really, it was when you model, think about Energized Denver and the implications of Energized Denver. And that's really all this requirement is meant to do.
Okay, so there's a motion on the table to modify table 407.3 with a second. I'll call a vote. All those in favor of that modification, please raise your hand. The 12, okay, go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. 0, and all those abstaining, please raise your hand. 0. Sorry, I saw 1 on there. So those modifications have passed. All right. So the floor is open for further discussion, but it sounds like we had great discussion on that. Does anybody want to make a motion on this proposal? Courtney.
I make a motion to approve as modified.
Great. Is there a second?
I'll second. This is Elizabeth.
Okay, Elizabeth seconds. Any discussion before I call a vote? Being none, I'll call a vote. The motion is to approve as modified. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. 0, and all those abstaining, please raise your hand. I have 0. And Linda, I know that you were phone only. Were you able to vote, Linda?
It looked like I could on my end.
Okay, great. Wanted to make sure. All right, so that passes. Thank you all for that. A little time check. We have 10 minutes till. Unless the committee wants to stick around, we will bypass item number 20 until next time. So thank you all for that, for joining today. Just a reminder, the next meeting is July the 19th. So we have some follow-up items on that subcommittee that wanted to talk about item number 6. See if you can get together and bring something to the table before then. I actually got a note here that we might want to hear item number 20. Eric, your hand is raised. Let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, is along those lines. I think introducing it with the 10 minutes we have left is okay. I recognize that it's may not be possible to discuss it all, and I wouldn't ask the committee to stay long after 5 to do that, but introducing it, I think would be okay. And then people can mull it over until the next hearing. and go from there. So that's my recommendation. I saw some other chats and had nods on that too.
Okay, I am all for that. Just know that when we come back next time, we will skip probably the public comment portion and go straight to discussion and voting or modifications or motions on that then. So Katrina, take it away. You got number 20.
Great. I will be very brief. I think this one is quick to introduce, and so we'll see if there is enough time then for discussion if it's very simple. I also don't want to rush anything, but I want to just say that similarly, we heard this proposal needed a little bit more vetting and stakeholder input. It was further developed and received a lot of support from the working group. This Appendix G site energy proposal provides a third modeling option that incentivizes all electric buildings. And as you've heard, we've seen how Appendix G really rewarded gas buildings. So this site energy appendix addresses that concern and had strong support from the working group for that reason. All right, Sean, you want to walk through the proposal?
We'll start with the fundamental, which is that this has been moved into an appendix and out of C407. And this was done for clarity to ensure that the requirements for site energy and energy cost didn't get mixed together. So now this is a nice standalone appendix. You just walk all the way through it for site energy. I did want to note that ASHRAE has been developing an addendum CH, which is using Appendix G with alternate energy metrics like site energy. What they had developed was very similar to what had been developed for Denver, but seeing as how this is what is most likely going to end up in Appendix G for site energy, we wanted to align this proposal as much as we could with what practitioners will be seeing in the future with Appendix G. So we used that addendum to modify the language. And most of what you see in this proposal is what do you have to do to replace energy cost with site energy throughout Appendix G. So it really is a lot of word replacement. There is very little substantive changes between the two. You'll see a lot of similar things. We have the relationship to Energize Denver, the reference to the same mandatory requirements that are in C407, good for consistency. You can see how PEI has been changed into PSEI. So instead of performance cost, it's now performance site. And a note about the BPFs, the exact same things that we talked about with the energy cost BPFs apply here. These are BPFs developed specifically for 2019 ASHRAE 90.1, but site energy based instead of energy cost based. The table functions the same way. You made a modification to these labels. You would probably want to make that same modification here. Otherwise, this has been aligned with the energy cost approach, basically in terms of everything except for it uses site energy instead of energy cost to facilitate the use for all electric buildings. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Katrina and Sean. We'll open it up to the general public. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in support, please raise your hand. See one hand up. Mark, go ahead. You'll have 2 minutes.
Just ditto use groups, and I'll have the rest of my time.
Okay, thank you. All right, anybody else that wants to speak from the general public in support, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we'll go to opposition. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Anybody from the general public that wants to speak in opposition, please raise your hand. Third and final call, anybody wants to speak in opposition? Seeing none, I'll go back to the committee. Committee, this is your time to ask questions. Anybody have questions? Second call for questions from the committee. Third call for questions from the committee. Seeing none. Mark or general public, any rebuttals in support? Please raise your hand. Second call, Mark, go ahead.
And real quick, would you explain to the committee, if nothing else, just how will the establishing language tell you that you're going to be able to choose one of these three paths? Did you already address that? If I missed it, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Kevin, if you would scroll to the top. So here in the charging language where it lays out, number one is the prescriptive path. Number two is building performance. So this adds Appendix SE, site energy, to the option. When we had the target, it added Appendix performance target, PT, to this same thing. So it's comply with C407 or this appendix.
Okay, thank you. Third and final call, anybody who has a rebuttal and support, please raise your hand from the general public. Being none, we go back to the committee now for discussion or a motion. Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'd like to make a motion to strike from table SE 103.3 the alphanumeric designations as we've done with the other proposals.
Okay, is there a second? Courtney?
Second.
Okay, great. I will call a vote on, well, before I do that, we got to check to see quorum on that. Charlie, how many voting members do we have? I think quorum's 14.
I think we have 13.
13 right now, okay. I guess Eric, Christie, City, do we want to proceed or table this for the next time? Just note that we didn't have quorum.
Yeah, let's go ahead and vote that we didn't have quorum. I wouldn't expect there to be objection considering the consistency with other proposals. So I'd ask that we call a vote on this amendment, please.
Okay, so I'll call a vote. All those in favor of that motion of striking the items in the parentheses in table SE 103.3, please raise your hand. 13, unanimous. Okay, go ahead and lower your hands. All right, any other discussions or motions? Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'll motion to table the remainder of this proposal until the next hearing.
Okay. Second. Is there a second? Just for formalities. Yeah.
I'll second.
Great. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Tabling this. At 12, go ahead and lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. 0, and all those abstaining, please raise your hand. 0. Okay, this will be tabled. Good news is that we can jump right into further discussion and motions once we return. So I'm glad we did hear that. Thanks everybody for the suggestions on that. It will save us some time next time. Well, it's almost 5 o'clock. Thank you all for joining us today. The next meeting, as I said, would be the 19th of July. If you can't make it, please find someone to fill in for you. So we do have quorum. I'll stop the recording, but I'll stay on the line. Anybody who wants to gripe about anything, the Rockies schedule, the Habs winning the World Cup, whatever, I'll stay on the line. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.